Hello there. Today I wanted to issue a challenge to the optimization community as a whole. The challenge is to find out what the highest possible damage per round on average there can be for each level in the game. I'm starting out this week just with level 1, which will be quite easy because there's not as many options and it will become exponentially more complicated and more difficult to find the later levels we move on. But given a particular rule set, which I will go over in a second, I wanted to see what I could come up with a lot of number crunching, and then after I release this, what everyone else could come up with to improve on it. If you're not really that big on optimization or like too used to these kinds of damage calculations, I thought this would be quite a fun video just to go over how this sort of side of things work, like how you can actually calculate your average damage per round, and then also go over a couple of the earlier game builds that are focused on damage so you can learn how those work. And this whole process just gives you quite a good base understanding of a couple optimization like principles and things like that. So anyway, without further ado, let's get onto the rules. So onto the rule set. I'll have a full list of all of this in the description. So to begin with, it's just a single target. So any kind of area effect or blasting doesn't work here. The combat will be your average over 4 turns. So for setup, things like Hexblade, it'll be averaged out for that. We'll be working with the average AC per CR level, or what the monster manual recommends per CR level for creatures, and it's going to be the same CR as your level. Obviously, this isn't a perfect system as it doesn't translate perfectly, but it's a reasonable compromise in my opinion. As for the limited resources that you have access to, I've decided to limit it to you can use half rounded up of your long rest resources. So for instance, if you had 2 spell slots of first level, you can use 1 first level spell slot. This is sort of to discourage the Nova builds and make it a bit more of an even meta, so to speak. And it's just not like most D&D games, you'll have a couple of encounters, so it's not really too reasonable to just blast everything on this one encounter. That being said, I think you should have complete access to all of your short rest resources. I think just because having weird numbers on the averages, like you might have like 1 or 2 encounters per short rest. But I didn't really want to have like 2/3 of your short rest resources. It would just get complicated. So I'm saying half of your long rest resources and all of your short rest resources. We're completely ignoring resistances and vulnerabilities here. I know that's not entirely realistic, but it does keep things simple. It'll be using a point buy, and you can have 1 turn for setup, but not for any kind of offensive spell. This includes things like Hex, which debuffs enemies. But setting up something like a Bless, I think, is reasonable to be able to set up with most combats outside of it, and in this specific circumstances, it will be. You'll be facing off against a melee character if that's important. You'll be attacked each round for the purposes of reactions for things like Tempest Cleric, but this is only worrying about offense. I'm ignoring defense, although you can't continuously proc opportunity attacks, so you can't do things like the Polar Master Cheese, where you could just like attack them and then leave, get your opportunity attack, and wait for them to come back into melee range with you, so you get your reaction each turn. I think that's unreasonable because that's never how you'd play in a real game. Looking at saves, I'll keep a link in the description, but someone made a spreadsheet compiling all of the creatures you'd be facing at each CR level. So we'll just be taking the average save per CR and just be using those as a baseline. These are a +1 to strength, a +2 to Dex, a +1 to Con, a -2 to Intelligence, a 0 in Wisdom, and a -1 to Charisma. I didn't actually use any saves in any of the builds that came up, but if a save comes up, we're using these numbers. So at low levels, this actually quite surprised me. Dexterity saves is actually the worst save to target. Con's not that bad. On top of that, because of the same like aforementioned cheese with the Polar Master, I'm just giving the enemy a 40 speed, so you can't, kite them, just going like 30 feet back and things like that, as if there's infinite space. We're not worried about that kind of thing, but that's just not something, again, that's realistic that you could do all the time. These rules are somewhat loosely meant to replicate the experience that you'd have in your most typical encounter, but D&D being D&D, there's infinite different possibilities that you can have for your encounters. So it's meant to be your most average encounter, but it will never work out that way. This is just meant to be as basic as possible as I can get the rules, while still being consistent and reasonable, because it doesn't translate perfectly. But it's a reasonable compromise. As for the limited resources that you have access to, I've to limit it to you can use. This is because this is sort of to discourage the and make it a bit. It's not like most D&D games. You'll have a couple of encounters, so it's not really too reasonable to just blast everything on them. I think you should have complete access to all of your short rests. I think just because having weird numbers on the averages, like you might have like 1 or 2 rests, but I didn't really want to have like 2/3 of your short rest resources. It would just get complicated, so I'm saying half of your long rest resources and all of your short rest rests. We're ignoring resistances abilities here. I know that's not entirely realistic, but it does keep things simple. You can have 1 turn to set up. You can have 1 turn for setup, but not for any kind of offensive spell. This includes things like Hex. But setting up something like a Bless, I think, is reasonable to have to be able to set up with most combats outside of it, and in this specific circumstances, it will be. You'll be facing off against a melee character if that's important, and you'll be attacked each round for the purposes of reactions, for things like the Tempest Cleric. But this is only worrying about offense. Alright, so moving on to look at some of the builds. So straight up, having a look at the base list of classes, Barbarians can obviously be viable. Bards, I wouldn't even really consider. At first level, you get access to a couple spells, but nothing that will affect your damage long term, or enough to be relevant. And your Bardic Inspiration you can't give to yourself, so I think we can safely ignore the Bard. Clerics are a big contender. They can get access to martial proficiencies, and also they get their domain at first level, which you'll see as a theme is really, really relevant. Druids could have some potential, mostly because of access to Shillelagh, but given all the calculations I did, they didn't become relevant. So we're ignoring Druids. Fighters obviously are also quite relevant. They get on top of all the martial stuff, they get the fighting style at first level, which is going to be their main edge. And I forgot to say before, Barbarian's main edge is rage and the +2 damage you get. So those are the main differences offensively between Barbarian and Fighter. Ranger doesn't get anything offensive at first level, so aside from normal martial stuff, so we will be ignoring them. Same with Paladins. Rogues are an obvious contender. They get their sneak attack and have martial proficiency. Sorcerers can't really be considered at this point. They don't have martial proficiency and they don't have any meta magic or anything like that. Warlocks are an obvious contender, especially Hexblades, getting access to things like Hex and Hexblade's Curse, as well as the Martial proficiency. And Wizards at this point don't really have anything, just a couple spells, but nothing that could be significant in the damage dimension. Artificers are a maybe. They only have spells, but they also get some martial proficiencies and some relevant spells. Nothing in the realm that can make them competitive with any of the builds shown. So, as is maybe predictable, every single one of these builds is using the custom lineage or the variant human to get access to a feat. The only competitive race I can think of is the half orc, but given how early it is and how little features we have, I don't think we get enough that we can synergize with those abilities and enough to bring out any kind of potential damage. However, I haven't actually done any of the calculations for that, so I could be wrong there. That might be an area that could be improved upon. So looking at a couple of the feats first, because I thought it would be interesting to do a little bit of a comparison and just an overview of how damage is calculated. First of all, I get the actual dice and just the straight up what I'd be dealing in a turn. So with Polon Master, at most you could have a D10, something like a glaive. As your action, you'd use that attack and you'd get a +3. And then as a bonus action, you get a D4 and another +3. So the way you can calculate your average damage from dice is you half the final number, so this 10 for instance, and add 0.5. So the average roll on a D10 is 5.5. The average roll on a D4 is 2.5. So adding all these up, you get 14. And I also put the crit damage down, which is 8, which is just the dice numbers. So that's 5.5 plus 2.5 is 8. Now you get your to hit chance. So at the moment we're working with an AC of 13. This is what the Dungeon Master's Guide says is the average CR or the expected CR. So how you calculate to hit, it's a little more complicated. The formula is 0.05, sorry, times 21 minus the armor class to hit, so 13, plus your to hit modifier. So this will be a +5, which is proficiency plus strength modifier. So +5. And for most things, this will be 65. But as you'll see later, there are some exceptions. So this needs to be calculated separately. Same with crit chance. It's just, if you've got a normal crit chance, it's 5. If you have an extended crit chance, it's 10. And then the final damage is another slightly complicated one. So what you take is your base damage that we calculated up here, and you times it by your chance to hit, so 0.65. Then you also add with your crit chance and how much extra damage you'll be doing on a critical hit. And if you add those, together, you get the final chance. So comparing a few of these that I thought it would be interesting to compare, Polar Master comes out on top at its base. However, there are some classes that have synergies with other feats, so it's not necessarily mean Polar Master is the right choice every time. So Great Weapon Master just has a bit of a problem with accuracy, but the way that Great Weapon Master's extra, because on a crit you get to use another attack as a bonus action. So when that happens, how you calculate that is you pretty much just increase your crit damage, and you increase it by the average damage you'll be doing without the critical. So the base crit increase is 7, and then you also do the same calculations we did earlier. So 0.4, it's less because of the -5 penalty, and it's more damage than you'd otherwise expect because obviously we get the +10. So that works out to be, on a crit, on average would be adding 15.35 damage. So then you just put that into your critical damage, and it's calculated here. With Crossbow Expert, it's very similar to Polar Master in that you get an extra bonus action attack, but the dice damage is lower, and that's why you'll see a difference there. And Sharpshooter, similarly to Great Weapon Master, it's the same -5 plus 10 to hit, but the dice damage is slightly lower, as well as Sharpshooter not getting the bonus critical damage. interestingly as well, I never found a build that was better using these strategies, but a lot came very, very close. So with Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, there's now a way to get 18 in a stat at level 1, and that is taking a 15 in Point Bay, getting a +2 from the racial bonus with your custom lineage, and then taking a feat that gives you a +1 to the ability score, so a half feat. And I think the best for this when we're talking about pure damage, in almost all cases, is either Crusher, Slasher, or Piercer. But as you can see, the best damage added up doesn't add up. So with a maul, you can use a maul with Crusher. I was also considering using dual clubs with Shillelagh, but it turns out that doesn't actually work. And I average to get like 8.05, which is added to other class features. It's pretty good. As you can see, it's relatively competitive with these feats, but it's not necessarily better. But certain things gain benefits from having a higher base than others. And you can see it's the same for Slasher. This will be using 2-weapon fighting with 2 short swords or scimitars, and Piercer at most is either a pike or a heavy crossbow. Yeah, let's start with a baseline. The baseline I'll be using, someone else has done this. I can't remember who it was. It was either Treant Monk or Minmax Munchkin that uses this as a baseline, or one of the more common optimizing channels. But I've been using this for a while as well. It's going straight Warlock using Hex and Eldritch Blast every round. And that's all. So at base level, you don't get an Agonizing Blast yet. So all you've got is the dice damage, a Eldritch Blast, and a Hex trigger. So that's a damage of 9 on average. And then if you crit, that's an extra 9 on average. No modifiers to either of them. So you've got your final damage here. And with that in 4 rounds, so here I've just got it times by 4. In 4 rounds, you'll be dealing this, and then I've got average here. In most cases, this will be the same as your final damage here. It's just this divided by 4, but some cases it's not. When different rounds you do different things or have access to different things. And I thought it might be a little more fair, just specifically at level 1, to take the Eldritch Adept feat and take Agonizing Blast. That would add on average 1.95 damage, which would get this up to about 8.25, I think. But maybe not. So what this baseline is pretty much, if you're dealing the baseline damage, you're dealing good damage. If you set out to deal good damage to be a damage dealer, and you hit this baseline, you've succeeded, essentially. At first level, this is probably lower than it should be relative to the high level, the better builds. At other levels, that's why I was considering adding Agonizing Blast, because you'll see at the moment, at second level and later on, the gap will lessen. But yeah, so at the moment, even relatively low to later on stuff, just immediately going to my first idea is just much better than the baseline. So the first idea is just going fighter and taking crossbow expert and taking the archery style. This is a pretty reliable and consistent build. Just take a hand crossbow. So you'll get 2 attacks. It's one of the easiest way to get 2 attacks early game. So you have 2d6 plus 6, which is 13 damage if you hit all the shots, and 7 on a critical, 7 extra on a critical. On top of that, you have a better chance to hit because the archery style gives you a +2, so your to hit is a +7. So that adds up to 10.1 on average and 40.4 after 4 rounds of combat. A slightly more optimized version of this is 2-weapon fighting with taking the Slasher feat. Now, Slasher doesn't actually add anything in itself damage-wise. However, that lets you get an 18 at base, as I described earlier. So with 2-weapon fighting and Slasher, you can add your mod twice, and your mod is now 4. So that's 2d6 plus 8, bumping up your final damage. You're slightly lower chance to hit, but because you've got the +1, and this one gets +2, it's still higher than average. So this bumps up your damage to 10.85 on average, or 43.4 after 4 rounds total. And this works out exactly the same with the fighter and the barbarian. With the fighter, you get your +4 on the second attack, whereas with the barbarian on both attacks, you get a +2. So it works out exactly the same. Now, moving on to Rogue, taking either 2-weapon fighter or crossbow expert. And the 2-weapon fighter is the new, I think it's martial adept feat, where you get to take a fighting style. So you take the 2-weapon fighting style. These both work out exactly the same. So you get 2d6 from each of your attacks, and then one of those attacks you can add sneak attack to, and the +6 is also added. So this works out to be 11.25. You've got your normal chance to hit and crit and all of that. And this is, you'll see, this is one of the higher, or at least getting into reasonably high critical advantages here, because you've got such a high dice count. And that's where the bulk of your damage is. But on average, we're moving up to 11.25. Finally, taking with the fighter, Magic Initiate, and taking Warlock with Hex. This does also add Booming Blade or Green Flame mode that you have access to. However, the secondary conditions on both of those, I don't think we could reliably set up. So we're just adding the base Hex. And I don't think any other cantrips, to my knowledge, would give you an advantage here. So with this, eventually, because the first round you have to set up Hex, but second, third, and fourth round, you get your 2 attacks in, and both of them get an extra 2d6 from Hex. Or, sorry, each attack gets a d6, which adds up to 2d6 extra per hit. So this gives us 20 damage on average, and then 14 on a critical. And you'll see here it's on average 13.7 once we're set up. And you'll see that's higher than, multiple others. So like Barbarian with Polearm Master or Fighter with Polearm Master, it's higher than both of those eventually. But because the first round, you have to use the Hex, you can't on the first round use your bonus action attack. And so your first round is just 2d6 plus 3. So the way I got rid of that is I just pretty much, because you only get like a half turn essentially compared to the others, you just times it by 3.5 and the math works out fine instead of times by 4. And then so in actuality, you move down to 11.9. So basically 12 damage on average per round over the 4 rounds. The reason I chose 4, by the way, I didn't say this earlier, it's somewhat arbitrary, but I kind of figured it was more or less the most amount of turns, well, probably higher. I'd say 3 is the average amount of turns a combat will last, but 4 is, I think, a reasonable amount. 5 is kind of higher, and the longer we go, the more set up builds are valued. I still want them to have some value, but I don't want them to be overvalued, because then you'll just get like Hexblade everywhere, when I think it's got too many problems realistically to, like, if you use this build, you won't be overly disappointed with the reaction. So yeah. But anyway, this is the first case of your average damage being lower than your initial count. So next we move on to Polearm Master. Now these will sort of dominate the top ranks, more or less, as you'll see. So starting out with Polearm Master, your first hit is your full D10 with like a glaive or a maul, or something like that. And your second hit goes down to a D4 as a bonus action, but you get your full modifier on both hits. And so we're using the Great Weapon Fighting style. This isn't a great style in what it adds, but it's okay. The way you work out how much it adds, and so on the D10 it adds 1.3 on average, and on the D4 it adds 0.5 on average. The way you essentially work it out is you can reroll 1s and 2s. The way it works is if you got a 1, you would have the average. You would have the average of a D10 because you have to use the next one. So if you roll a 1 again, you have to stick with the 1. So if you rolled a 1 or a 2, you pretty much get the average of a normal D10, which is 5.5. So the way you traditionally, you can kind of work it out intuitively, but the way you'd full first principles work out the average damage of a dice is you'd add up all the possible such scenarios, assuming they're weighted evenly, which they should be because it's a fair dice, and then divide it by the total number of scenarios. So this will essentially be like 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 all the way to 10 divided by 10, which works out to be 5.5. Instead, this time, a 1 is equivalent, rolling a 1 on the first try is equivalent to getting a 5.5, and same with a 2. So you can do 5.5 plus 5.5 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, so on. And that works out to be 1.3 higher than 5.5. So that's 6.8. Turns out to be the average roll on a D10 if you're re-rolling the 1s and the 2s once. And on the D4, it's the same situation. You go, average roll of a D4 normally is 2.5. So you go 2.5 plus 2.5 plus 3 plus 4 divided by 4. And that works out to be 3, which is 0.5 higher than the D4. So now that works out to be 15 damage, because 6.8 plus 3 plus 6, 15 damage, and then just the dice, so just these parts. I'm assuming Great Weapon Fighter, I didn't actually check this, I probably should have double checked this, but I'm pretty sure Great Weapon Fighter still works on the crit dice that you roll, because the description is weapon damage dice. So yeah, no changes to hit chance, so that works out to be 10.76 on the first turn. Oh, and another aside, and maybe I should put this in the official rules, but the scenario in my head is that you can get one Polar Master reaction trigger, because, and I should write this down in the official rules, you're going to start 30 feet apart in my head. So what you can do is, if you win initiative, you walk up to them, use your attacks, but you stay 10 feet away because you've got reach, so you don't need to trigger an opportunity attack. So also just put 5 feet reach in the rules, so you don't trigger an opportunity attack, and then so you just back up out of the range because you move 25 feet to get there, so 5 feet back. So they will then have to move into your range, so you get your reaction attack off. But to trigger more of those reactions, you'd need to use a disengage or something like that. So the extra damage that you would get from a pollen reaction, I did over here. There are specialties to it, but essentially, I'm assuming it's first turn before you get anything else off. I think I was unfair on the Hexblade. Like, I could have done a lot of calculations for a rather insignificant amount of results, but it's technically slightly higher than this. But basically, it's D3 plus D10 plus 3, sorry. And so just works out to be 5.8 damage on average. And so I just added that in this calculation. So it's that plus 4 plus getting that. And also because of Great Weapon Fighter, because you're also adding it to Polar Master, I also added the if hit, get your rerolls in. And that should work out. So on average, that bumps this damage up to 12.4. So you'll see this one here is higher than the average, final damage. Now looking at the monk, I did a couple calculations with the different feats you could take, but eventually landed on taking Hex to be the best. But I did try it with the others, and this definitely came out on top. So yeah, take Magic Initiate Hex. Now the base damage, and this is the same as the previous Hex user. It takes 1 turn to set up to get to this point, but you'll get your D8 off and your D4 off, and both of those get Hex damage, and you get to add your modifier to both. So these numbers here, 20 and the 14, are the same for the fighter with Hex as the monk with Hex, because a D6 and a 2D6 and a D8 and a D4 work out to be exactly the same. But where the difference is on the first turn you get your D8 off on your first attack, whereas a fighter only gets 1d6. So this is where the slight difference comes in. I just found an error there where I was forgetting to add my modifier to the damage I took off here. So this was slightly lower than it should be. So this is actually less damage than the Fighter Polar Master, but not by a hell of a lot. So how the Monk works is, it's basically the same as the 2-weapon fighter, but on the first round you only lose a d4 instead of a d6. So that works out to be 1 less than this in both the normal damage and the critical damage, whereas this one uses that. So on average, it's a little higher than the fighter 2-weapon fighter plus hex. But where the hex really comes into its own is with rogue and 2-weapon fighting. So with rogue, you get sneak attack once per turn, and then you also get the 2d6 from each of your offhand attacks, and each of those proc hex. But of course, you don't get the 3 from your secondary attack, which means you also lose less on the first round of combat. So this is only 0.5 more damage as like the base attack, but you also crit for a lot more because more of your damage comes from dice. So on average, this is only 0.5 more than Monk when it gets going, but first round, of course, you lose less. So this is -7 because you don't have to add your modifier in this one. So it's only 7, which is the 2d6. I can actually add crits here. I'll just do that real quick, which is 0.05 times your critical damage on a single hit, which would be 2d6, which is 7. So still very, very close to 13. So that's the rogue with using hex. Now, for onto the 3 strongest builds. This isn't actually necessarily true. There's a bunch of clerics that are in this range, but for the Polar Master with Barbarian, Polar Master works best with Barbarian at first level. This is because you get to add your +2 twice, whereas the alternative is using Great Weapon Fighting, which is just not great. So the +2 is much better. Now, your base damage is 18, which you'll see is a good bit higher. It's only like 2.2 higher than the fighter, but still a significant amount. And then you actually get less crits because you can't use your Great Weapon Fighting on the crits, and it's all in the pure plus numbers. But so that works out to be 12.1, total 55.5, and then scaling down to 13. This is the same each level, but you also get your Polar Master attack, and I also this isn't considering that you also get your +2, so I just added the 2 times chance to hit. That works out to almost 14. And finally, it was no surprise that it was very high, but Hexblade, specifically the Polar Master Hexblade Warlock, normally called the PAMlock. This can deal some really crazy damage when it gets going. Like this is 17.75 compared to the others, which are like at highest 13.7 or 14.2 here. So definitely a couple more than that. Although it takes longer to get going than anything else here, because in the first round you have to hex, and on the second round you Hexblade's Curse, which means you don't get your bonus action attack on both rounds. PAMlock is still the best. I tried it with increasing charisma and Great Weapon Master, and both still worked. Polar Master worked better than both of those still. And you can't use Sharpshooter or Crossway, so it'll be the same story. So on round 1, you only get to deal 8.25 because you're using a bonus action hex, and then just using your normal polearm attack. And then on your second round, you have to set up your Hexblade's Curse, so you only get the +2, so that's only dealing 10. damage. Hexblade Curse also increases your crit range. As you'll see here, I just put this up to 0.1. So that increases your crit chance and makes things better off. And then for your final 2 attacks, you get to use this massive damage where you also get your bonus action. So on your bonus action, you deal your D4, you also get your hex damage, and you also get the bonus Hexblade's Curse damage for the +2. So your final damage being a D10 plus a D4 plus 2D6 plus 10. Works out to be quite a bit. And so total on average, that's 17. But then cancelling out over all rounds, it's 14.8. So very close to 15. Now finally onto clerics. I had quite a few. So with clerics, there's a lot of options for good builds. There were 4 main domains that came to my mind when looking at the best damage. So first of all, the War Cleric, they get a bonus action attack, but that's a resource that's used up. More on that later. There's the Forge Cleric, which gets to basically turn your weapon into a +1 weapon, so you get +1 to attack and damage rolls. There's the Peace Cleric, which gets to stack Bless and an effect similar to Bless, which is D4 as well. So you get 2d4 extra on your attacks. But the problem with Peace is that it doesn't get martial weapons. But still, I used a quarterstaff and Polearm Master, and it still was relatively competitive. I think it was actually still above the Barbarian Polearm Master. And also the Tempest Cleric I looked at because it was reasonable. You could trigger your reaction as many times as you could. Which would have been 2, and it's 2d10, or 2d8. So that would have added up, but it just wasn't enough. And on top of just getting normal martial stuff, so you could have done the normal martial things. But your bonuses from War Cleric just ended up being significantly more. But that's also where the saves came in. You haven't needed to calculate saves. So here are some of the quick numbers. I'll just double check. I doubt this will be very easy, and even if it was a good view, my handwriting is awful, so this won't be easy to read. But some of my numbers on those things, I tried out adding strength, adding 2 weapon fighting, Polearm Master, and Great Weapon Master for all of these. All of these where I could. You can Great Weapon Master with Peace Domain because of the lack of martials. But yeah, so War came out to be the best, but pretty much all clerics. I think War was the only one that bet 13.3 versus. Yeah, so War was the only one that bet the PAMlock, but all of them came out very high. I think 1 or 2 were maybe less than the Bard Polearm Master, but they were all using the best feat combination or bet out the Barbarian. So a couple of things that make the Cleric really good is they get pretty much all of the normal martial stuff that every other class gets access to. The only thing that gives so fighters get their fighting style and barbarians get their +2, but that's not really that much of an edge when it comes down to it, because the Cleric also gets some good spells. All of them get access to Bless, which is 2.5 extra on average for your plus to hit rolls, which is really strong. Or you can add a d4 to every attack using Divine Favor, which War Cleric gets access to. And Divine Favor usually came out to be better than Bless in terms of damage, except for the actual one they ended up winning, which was using Great Weapon Fighting with the War Cleric, because accuracy synergizes well with it. That's obviously pretty familiar. Yeah, if you're wanting more of the numbers, I just felt like there was way too many of them and they were clogging up tons, so I just decided to take the best of the clerics. Because otherwise, there'd just be so many clerics at the top, and I just felt like it wasn't necessary to have them all there. But if you want me to add the numbers to the description or in a comment or something, just comment that. And so this is our winner. So War Cleric gets a number of bonus attacks equal to their wisdom, where they can just do their normal attack as a bonus action. So the reason Polar Master wasn't too good is because you already got 2 bonus attacks, and these bonus attacks can be as strong as they need to be. So in this case, using a greatsword or a maul for the 2d6. So you get 2 of these attacks. On top of that, you can stack Great Weapon Master with them, which is something using like, normally you're using a feat to get your bonus action attack. So the fact that you can use Great Weapon Master, like that's kind of like how later on you'd combine Polar Master and Great Weapon Master to get, the 2 attacks with Great Weapon Master, which is a lot stronger. The only other thing that gets 2 attacks that I've looked at without a feat is the monk, and the monk can't use great weapons. So that's the main reason why it's so strong. And you get, because you get your wisdom modifier per long rest. If you get a 16 in wisdom, that's 3 of them, and so I'm doing half rounded up, so that's, you get to use 2 of those bonus actions. If I was letting you go full blast, War Cleric actually benefits more than anything else here. So this is actually toned back by that rule. And so yeah, looking at this, in a turn, when you're fully set, well, this is kind of the opposite of a setup. You can go full blast at the start and then you run out. So you get 2 turns with the 2 attacks and then 2 without. So when you're using the 2 attacks, this is by far the highest. This is 40 damage, whereas the next highest is the PAMlock, which is 25. So almost double the damage of the next best when it's at its best. And then crits, it's 46, so that's just 14. However, this is much less accurate. So you'll see I've only got the 2.5 here, and that's coming from Bless. If I didn't have the Bless, this will be as low as 0.4 to hit, but Bless brings it up to 0.525. So that's a reasonable chance to hit, but it's still quite low. So we'll be missing quite a bit. And so that brings that down to 21.7 on average, which is still very, very high. Like just looking back at the Barbarian, PAM, Polar Master, it's, like close-ish to double. So very strong. But of course, you only get 2 attacks with it. And after that, you have to bring it down to just the 2d6 plus 13. It's a little more than half because of Great Weapon Masters. If it crits, you get a bonus action attack. So the way that works, I did the same thing before, but your base crit damage on a single hit is 7. And then adding on the crit, you've got a secondary attack, which is just your normal hit to hit chance times your damage on a hit plus your chance to crit and then crit damage. So on a crit, on average, you'll be adding 17.85 damage, but it's still a relatively low chance to crit, so it's not a huge difference. But yeah, that brings it down to 11.39 on average when you've used your extra attacks. And so, doing half rounds with the 21 and half rounds with the 11, that adds up to 66. And so that brings it down to an average of 16.5 around. And that's our winner. And for reference, the most amount of health I could find for a monster in the monster manual was 52 for the giant octopus. But that also has a lower AC, so these things will actually be dealing more damage. But every single build, well, the top 3 builds already can take out in 4 moves the strongest thing up against them. I think it's pretty likely that the War Cleric can actually take it out in 3 moves. But yeah, considering that's the strongest thing I could find, and probably well above the CR that it actually should be, yeah, let's go figure. So the details on that, on what you'd be doing as the War Cleric, is you'd take Variant Human, you'd go for a 15 in Wisdom and Strength from your point buy, and then get a +1 for both. So you actually need to be the Variant Human, not the Custom Origin, because you need the 2 +1s, because both your Wisdom and your Strength is important. Take Great Weapon Master, use a Great Sword, take War Cleric, and use Bless. And that's it. I have a graph here of just all of the different ones, considering all rounds. So see how they move out, and then looking at the averages. So if anyone thinks they can top this number, 16.54625 damage on average per round, given my rules, I would welcome that. I'm not sure what possibilities I haven't explored that I overlooked. But yeah. So I'm just in post here, but since I recorded, I've actually found an improvement on the final, although it's using some tech that I'm not sure if it works. I did a bit of research and found some conflicting results, but I'll just go over it. So first of all, I made an improvement on the base Hexblade. It's still not stronger than the War Cleric, but I thought it was notable, and it's using the double scimitar. So what the double scimitar does is, on its main attack, it's got 2d4, but it also opens up a special move, and as a bonus action, after you use that attack, you can use it. You can do a normal attack, but it uses a d4 instead, similar to Polo Master, but it doesn't actually take a feat to do it. This isn't heavy, so it doesn't work with Great Weapon Master. Otherwise, that would be very, very strong. But anyway, so how you can improve on the Hexblade, it goes from a 14.88 all the way up to a 15.8, so almost a full step higher of a full damage point per round. So you're going to start off with a great sword instead, just while you're setting up your other 2 bonus actions. So you start with you hex and then attack with your we're also taking a doing the getting an 18 in charisma. And there weren't any feats that benefited, so I just said like actor or something like that would work. And you start by hexing and then using your greatsword, and that does this much. And then on the next turn you use your Hexblade's Curse, and that increases it to this. And then finally, at the end of your second turn, you use a free action to drop, or you interact with objects to drop your greatsword, and then at the start of your next turn, you draw your double-bladed scimitar. And so then you can get your 2 attacks off. And that bumps up the damage to this. Also, the new Fathomless Warlock actually deals more damage than the old Hexblade. And so, but this again uses the tech that I'm not sure of, which is Hex and Magic Missile. I found conflicting sources on whether Hex applies to each of the magic missiles, but for now I just went with it. First time you set up your Hex and then go Magic Missile, and that's dealing 3d4 plus 3d6 plus 3 damage. And it's a guarantee to hit, so that's 21 damage. Just guaranteed first turn. And then next turn you bring out your tentacle, whatever it's called. And I found using a quarterstaff instead of Eldritch Blast ends up with more damage as long as you can get a 16 in strength, which you can if you take Variant Human. And then also the feat you're taking to get Magic Missile is Aberrant Dragon Mark. And this also has a feature that you can use. You can expend a hit dice to deal to roll that hit dice, and if you get an odd number, you can deal that much damage to an enemy. So what that works out to be is 2 damage on average because you've got a D8. So yeah,
the average, if you do roll an odd number, is 4, and then you've only got a 50% chance to roll an odd number, so that adds 2. So you can add that once, and so your final damage is 1 round with the magic missile, and then 3 rounds with the setup, and then adding 2 from the aberrant damage, and that works out to be above the previous PAMlock. And then finally, their main big damage is using Hexblade and Magic Missile. So the first round you set up with a Greatsword, similar to the first one, and then you drop it at the end of the turn, use your Hexblade's Curse, and then use Magic Missile. And this will deal 27 damage. And I think it's pretty confirmed that Hexblade's Curse works with Magic Missile. It's just Hex that I wasn't sure about. And so that gets off 27 damage, and then finally on your last turn you draw your double-bladed scimitar, and you on your last 2 turns, sorry, and you can get those attacks off like that. And so that ends up with an average of 18.26 damage per turn, which is compared to the War Cleric's 16.5. It's almost 2 higher than it, so it's a big improvement on it. Although, again, I don't know if it's confirmed or not, if Hex works with Hexblade's Curse. Just look for level 2 sometime in the future. I'm not sure if it'll be my video for next week, but at some point I'll be doing it. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, like, comment, subscribe. And see ya.